I want to welcome a very dear friend of mine to the show today. Randy Shepard is joining us from RSAE Labs, and he's going to talk about pivoting and the importance of it and all that he's done in his business. Thank you, Randy.
Thank you, Pamela. So they didn't always used to call it pivoting. You know, it's gone by a lot of different names. You know, flip-flopping, backpedaling. You know, just changing your mind. But around 2010, they did come up with a formal term for it, basically in the VC community, probably out at Sand Hill Road, out in the Bay Area. It came around about the same time as the lean business process goes. So you'll see some of that tied together here. But it's gone on forever. But I think it's important, regardless of what market you're in, what services or products you offer, and what domain you're targeting, to understand that you know, it can often be a strategy, and it oftentimes isn't necessarily out of desperation, but that you see a new opportunity. Okay, that things could be going just fine, but then all of a sudden there's a brighter star or a new opportunity for a first adopter for a modification, or there's an opportunity to open up in a different market or different domain. And so we're going to cover some of those terms and some of those dimensions as we go through this. And yes, I will cover some of my colored background in pivoting, so to speak. But you know, before we get into that, I want to bring it down to more of a human level here. Is that you do these things not just only in business, you do these in everyday life. The decisions you make, you know, whether to be married or not to be married, whether to have children or not to have children, whether to go to college or not to go to college, or what you major in at college. All these things are big decisions, and we know people, and maybe ourselves, that have pivoted on many of those things over our life. So we're just going to bring it into the business domain. So in that regard, a pivot is not just a change of your product. It's not that you get into a business and all of a sudden, boy, you know, we should be doing Mexican, not Italian. You know, it could be lots of things within the business model. And you're probably, how many people are familiar with these 10 or these 9 different areas? Anybody that really hasn't seen this chart before? If you haven't seen this chart, take a look at it. There's a lot of good information here. I know there's a lot of courses that go through each one of these. I got to sit through one not too long ago, I think it was SCORE, that provided it, and they do that periodically. So keep an eye out for the lean process and the different business elements here for your business modeling and business planning. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through each one of those, but let's just go through and list labels. I think they're pretty much self-explanatory, but if anybody has any question, generates any conversation, stop me and we'll dive in deeper. So the first one is key partners. Again, the marriage analogy comes up, but business is like a marriage, more so than many might think, and it can be as complicated. Whether you have children or not can be analogous to how much capital assets you have, and how you basically divide the blanket up when you go to separate or change partnership. And it's not that you might be getting rid of somebody, but even adding somebody, because all of a sudden your roles and responsibilities are changing, and the existing partners have to decide who's doing what, and what the pecking order is, and whose domain is their dominant, who has the dominance in a particular domain, etc. So don't take it lightly that you're adding or changing or deleting a partner, but this is a pivot. This is a pivot. That's major change, and I do have a few examples of that. Key activities. And so, this is basically what you do. Are you a farmer or are you a landscaper? Well, they're kind of the same, but, the fact that you go from one to the other, that's a pivot. That's a change. And it might look minor, but when you think about the equipment and the other things associated with business of financing and marketing and sales and et cetera, business structure, it can be significant. And then key resources. Okay, I'm going to go organic versus outsourcing. I've decided that, we want to control everything from cradle to grave. We don't want to be dependent on anybody. We're going to have it under our positive control all the time. Or all of a sudden, for this product line, there's so much capital investment in equipment and machinery, and it's a risk, and we're not sure we're going to be in this business long enough to amortize that capital investment. It makes sense to outsource it. Let somebody else that already has those capital assets, and that could be, again, you're going to bake cookies, you're going to bake baked goods, okay? Am I going to buy a commercial oven, or am I going to go someplace and rent time in a commercial oven? Or am I going to I'm really running a bakery, and so I don't feel like I need to cook everything. I'm going to cook some things, but other things I'm going to outsource. All right? But that's a change as you change your mix of resources. And then your value proposition. Well, this is basically how you sell things. And that could include whether it's maybe a lease model or versus a sales model, whether you're going to directly to the end user, or you're going to set up value-added resellers and have sales channels. And so your value proposition to a value-added reseller would be much different than that to an end customer. So look at your value proposition as a pivot and a major change that really you need to take into consideration how it affects the other elements. And each of these, that's kind of what we're highlighting, is you might think you're only changing one of them, but there tends to be a ripple effect as you make those changes. So look at that, analyze it, and put it in context before you make that pivot. Then we've got customer relations. Again, some of these overlap. You could have, again, direct sales. You could have sales channels. You could go online. You could do telemarketing. What is your customer relationship? A lot of this gets into after product support. Who's going to handle the warranties? Who's going to handle the maintenance? Are you going to have to stock spares? What is the relationship relative to your response time in solving a problem? Is that something? Are you going to have to set up a depot someplace versus having everything in a central location? So look at that relative to your customer relationships. Again, channels. Yep, goes back to whether you're going through a value-added reseller, whether you're going to, say, retail, you're going to open up brick and mortar versus going online. A lot of people have tried to go from the eBay online thinking, boy, I know how to do this, and all of a sudden they lease a building. And boom, all of a sudden, oh my goodness, look at all these extra expenses and the overhead that I underestimated. And they just thought that the channels were going to be better, having a face-to-face, but didn't really calculate all the extra overhead and complexity of that, even though they had the same product and services, value proposition, everything else was the same. And let's go over to customer segment. And I talk about this a little bit more, but the segment could be local versus state, versus the whole continental U.S., versus going international, versus going global. And I call those, domains. And, just because you have a great, Italian restaurant here in Panama City doesn't mean you can go to Atlanta and open up the same Italian restaurant and think it'll do the same thing. So, the customer segment, and again, when you go international in particular, start looking at regulations, particularly if you're in the technical field, all the certifications, your FCC certifications and your consumer electronics certifications, your environmental, all of those have to be redone. And that's cost. Or you don't do it, and that could end up being liability. So really look at customer segment, even though, that looks like a huge potential there. Look at what it's going to do to your overall business before you pivot. Cost structure, Lynn.
Can I add to your conversation?
Yes, please.
I'm actually going to.
Thank you.
I want to.
I knew there was some more expertise here in the room.
I did teach this with the veterans business this last spring, and so I got immersed in this quite in detail. And you see where this bar is right here, and this is cost structure versus revenue stream. Well, this happens to fall right underneath value proposition. And so in a way, what you really do is you kind of start right here in the middle of the value. This is sort of you. This is what I'm trying to do. It start kind of in the middle. And what you do is you really kind of say, okay, I want to go to where's my customer segments that I'm going to reach? How do I get the channel? Well, this is sort of like a circle here. And then when I start talking about my resources, then I have to have, what are my key resources, what are my activities? So you get kind of a circle in here. And then of course, these two things, this is what it's going to cost me to get to this point. This is the revenue that's going to come back in. So you sort of look at this thing from, you start here, kind of do a circle here and kind of do a circle here. And these two things come into the middle. And that's really the way to look at this as an outline.
Excellent. And so I think the point is there that when you look at a cost structure, you also have to look at the revenue stream that's generated from that. You're going to sell something. Are you going to do it at a loss leader in order to pick up a residual? And what do I mean by that? Look at the cell phone model. They subsidize or give away or deeply discount a cell phone to lock you into a 3-year plan. So they've done, a trade-off between how they do their cost structure and what their revenue model is. And I call it the razors and razor blades. You give away that razor and then you got them razor blades. Printers have done this for years, right? You buy that $99 printer and you find out that they only gave you ink enough for 100 pages, and then after that it's $100 to replace the ink cartridges. You can go buy another printer cheaper. So there are a lot of models that you need to look at that. I can tell you, just to kind of jump ahead to my particular situation, before we were acquired by Cubic in 2010, I had the razor and razor blade model. We were covering our cost on global tracking devices. We weren't making much, if any, margin, maybe setting aside enough to cover the warranty expenses that we were projecting. We got acquired by Cubic, and all of a sudden they tripled the price. Okay, he said, no, we're making it on the front end, even though we've got a residual of reoccurring revenue from communications and data processing. We want that too. Well, you can imagine what it did. It basically killed a lot of markets, that maybe had some discretion to do other things, and left us really with only one market, which was the US DoD, that needed our class of service. But when that market went away in December 2012 with a cruise missile strike in Western Pakistan, their business model went pretty south pretty quickly, and there wasn't any diversification. So we can get into that more. But you can see major decisions. I'm not saying one is right and wrong, but it all depends on the market and your market analysis, market assumptions as to which way you go. And by goodness, yeah, you might have to pivot as your market assumptions change or the environment changes. Any question on the 9 elements? I mean, the biggest thing we wanted to point out is there's this perception that, oh, pivoting just means when you go in and, you know, you're going to do product A, and boy, you know, we didn't really get in the lean process. We had the assumptions. We went out and tested it. It didn't work, so we're coming back and pivoting to a different product, and we're going to go through that process. No, it could affect any element of your business planning. Yes, Len.
If I was going to change that chart at all, I would take the cost structure and the revenue streams and put them on the top, you know, because I just...
You think those are what change most often?
Well, I think those things are kind of like the starting point for the I mean, you know, you gotta run some rough numbers first. You can get into the details later, but I mean, if you can run some rough numbers before you start doing all this kind of stuff. You know, one of the things about this is this whole structure means that you don't have to write a business plan. You can sort of figure it out as you go. And I like that. I don't have any problem with that. But it puts the cost and the revenue down at the bottom. And I'm a much more, look, I can run some numbers on something real quick, kind of tell you whether it's, you know, whether you've got a logical way to approach something. So in my way, I kind of argue with this in a way because it's not financially as strong as I would do.
And that's a good perspective. But you know, I guess the way I see this model is that if I'm going to change one thing, I don't have a business plan until I've gone through all the other 8 boxes and adjusted them accordingly. I can't stop at just one thing. And some people might argue it's tough to start with your cost structure, your revenue structure before you know what your product is. And you know, so given a set of assumptions, but this is an iterative process. You know, in engineering design, the lean process we call spiral design. And we've done it for decades. A spiral design, basically where you can either, you know, you're either going to do the one-shot design to the moon where you're going to spend, you know, 10 years trying to design that one rocket because it's got to work, or you're going to do a lot of trials first. You're going to do a spiral design like the space program did, right? You know, unmanned, then with animals, and you build up. Those were all spiral designs where you're building as you go, and you're not trying to build that end rocket the first time. I see the business plan being the same thing. Don't spend months, let alone even, I don't think even weeks, maybe a few days getting through the 9 elements and getting to something that you can kind of sit back and analyze and start to get peer reviews and responses from. And then as you adjust, make sure you go through every element again before you feel you have something that's really worth further analysis. All right, on the side here, again, just emphasizing that changing all of them. But the last point, and this is one you'll see in my experience, and we've kind of worked on this or thought about this a lot, and that's the difference between domain versus market versus solution or service, and how it's easy to maybe change 2 of those things at once, but boy, changing 3 of those at once is really tough. And I'll give you an example. Again, back you're in the restaurant business, and you're doing an Italian restaurant. And in the same market, maybe in the same neighborhood, you want to open up a Mexican restaurant. Okay, you've got a network, you understand the traffic flows, okay, relatively low risk. But now, all of a sudden, you want to go to Atlanta and not open up an Italian restaurant that you know anything about, but you're going to open up a Mexican restaurant in Atlanta. All of a sudden, wait a minute, now you're switching both your domain and your service along with market, and all of a sudden, well, you got a lot more risks. You don't know the traffic, you don't know you don't have a support network. So in my world, that was, okay, we're going to be a service organization where we're doing system testing. And all of a sudden then, boy, we know how to do this better than these guys we're testing at, so all of a sudden, we're going to get into the product business, okay? Well, that's fine. You're in the DoD space, and you're doing that, so you're switching from, just doing testing to doing products. But now let's do that where we're not only going to switch type of service from testing to products, but we're going to go from the DoD market to the commercial market, or from the US market to the global market. And it's those kind of changes where you're changing all three elements at once that are really a yaha. And very difficult to do, can work, but much riskier. So just consciously think about that. How many dimensions am I trying to change here in my model at once? I tend to be a believer that, change one thing at a time. Because then if it doesn't work or it matters, you know what to relate it to. You change two things at a time and it doesn't work. You don't know which it was. It was a combination of one or one or the other, and where do you fall back to? Where do you change? So try to change one thing at a time as you go forward, or at least go through that analysis first. Brent.
So you spend all your time doing analysis and you can't run your business because you're trying to problem solve because you jumped in too many different variables.
Exactly. And to that, it makes the analysis more complex, which means you have to spend more time gathering data. And to your point, yeah, who's flying the plane?
And it really means you should have done this first before you did any of those changes.
Well, there are a lot of reasons to pivot. And it's not because somebody made a stupid idea or a stupid assumption. Markets change, okay?
And you've got examples of that.
I have changed, examples of market changing. All right. So just to give some examples of some of the greatest, least tech-related pivots in history, YouTube started out as a Valentine's 2005 as a video dating site, now worth several $1 billion. Okay, Twitter. Okay, it was podcasting, right? It was just, just trying to handle podcasts. Now, billions of dollars. You got Instagram, a very confusing mobile app called Burn that, wasn't used. So guess what? They pivoted. Flickr, another one, role-playing game. Groupon. A fundraising site for social groups, okay? Now it's broad. So again, similar product, but definitely different domain, different. And then this is a funny one, Nokia, okay? Obviously known for cell phones around the world. And here they started out in the paper mill business, but then pivoted over to selling rubber galoshes. So they were in a pivot mode, and then somehow they got from galoshes to to phones. So, and then I thought this was fun. Nintendo. Basically playing cards. Well, you could see, they were in the entertainment business. So all of a sudden they saw where, can we do a video version of a card game? Okay.
Was it the Pokemon card game? Was it the Pokemon card game?
I don't think Pokemon was around back then. I'm not sure, but Pokemon I think is more recent. Nintendo's been around a while. Yeah. And then PayPal started out basically just a PDA to PDA type of transaction application, and boom, what is it, $100 billion now or something? I mean, so these are all what they call in the unicorn club, basically the $1 billion in 10-year kind of folks, and each one of them had a pivot. So don't be ashamed or hesitate if a pivot's appropriate. So, and most successful startups, and again, depending on the statistics, there's between 60 and 90% that fail, depending on how you categorize a startup. Majority fail, okay? And the majority that succeed, okay, have done some type of adjustment in one of these 9 business plan elements. All right, here we go. So I'm going to move through this pretty quickly, but it's both an example of how in a business, but also in your personal life, you make some changes. And so I was an Air Force officer in 1979, had just come out of Stanford, and was a professor at the Air Force Academy in astronautical engineering. I had the opportunity to become a principal investigator for fire control research, basically weapon control systems and radars, and that led me to the opportunity to come here to Panama City and Tyndall for some research as we were putting equipment on then the F-106 and later on the F-15. What happened after my 4 years at the Air Force Academy, I had the opportunity to pivot. And as my wife will tell you, it was close to getting out and going to fly for the Guard, and or stay in and do something related. And I got a job here at Tyndall Air Force Base, setting up a radar test facility. Lynn?
So the Air Force Academy is really mostly engineering, isn't it? Isn't it strong on engineering?
It is strong, but it is a full, university curriculum relative to history. I mean, they don't have drama. They don't have a lot of liberal arts, but they have liberal as a degree. But certainly, history and international affairs and languages are very strong. But you're right, it is a lot engineering.
With this time frame, but where were the computers at this time?
So I was actually in the astronautical engineering and computer science department. So computer science was combined with Astro because Astro was the biggest user of computers early on at the time. And so that they were combined. They've since been separated, but we were, as a result, the largest department because of the two domains.
That would have been a pivot.
You're right. You're exactly right. Yeah. So in the meantime, I was pivoting in careers, going from astronautical engineering to actually at the radar test facility, I was a double E. We were doing electronic countermeasures and a lot of digital signal processing, and so it was more double E related and it was testing related. And we did a lot of things on aircraft tests and that. So I was fortunate to continue to fly with the test squadron while having that. But then I decided to pivot again, and it was actually some compatriots of mine who still live in the local area that we convinced ourselves that we should get out in 1987 and start a business. We actually started the first PC clone business here in the area back in probably 84 timeframe, even before we got out. But while I switched domains from Air Force to private sector and opened up an office for SAIC, I stayed in kind of the same solutions. We basically had a lot of technology that we developed on the Gulf Range and at the test facility here. And so we basically marketed that to Edwards Air Force Base and White Sands and other areas and had brought in a lot of business for SAIC in doing basically range upgrade. But after in 1990, 91, those of you that were active in the business community or the market back then, the DoD market kind of went down. It was starting to go down pretty big, kind of like just a couple years ago, right? With things similar to the sequester and all that. And so we had this hard decision, do we switch domains? Do we get out of the DoD? And boy, how do you take range testing and take that over to the commercial sector? And all of a sudden we were faced with this, double transition. We got to come up with something new and take it to commercial sector. Well, it ended up being a little bit related. We got to transition over the commercial sector with Blockbuster. Part of what we were doing in range testing was high-speed data recording. So we were the biggest buyer of Raycal recorders and anything we get our hands on to record high-speed data. We became very familiar with the technology and the limitations, and came up with a concept to basically develop a 40 times real-time VHS recorder. Well, who would want that? Well, at the time, Blockbuster wanted that because their shelves were full. They couldn't get all the content they wanted. They didn't have enough volume depth. They were running out of the top hits. They were missing sales opportunity. So they said, if you can reproduce a VHS tape in 3 minutes, we want it. We went to work and did that. And we actually built a prototype, built a business plan, went around and started looking at all the points of presence around the country that were empty. I don't know if you know these big block houses that AT&T owns and all that. Okay, they're 90% empty. You know, in the 60s and 70s, they used to be all the switches, and then when everything went digital, they went down to about 10% of the space, right? And so it was available. If you wanted to put server farms there, you had the fiber coming in. So the idea was we'd have the top 100 titles in the store, and then at the local point of presence, we'd have the top 1,000, and then, you know, we'd have basically more depth around the country that could be brought in over fiber and basically make movies. And we did this. Great. The problem was the business model, okay, started to change. Why? Because DVD started to come on the horizon. We saw the first hints of DVD. And so before we could get the recorder into production and get the cost down, again, you know, typical startup, you come up to that cliff, you got it ready, now I need to basically have a launch volume to get my prices down so that my value proposition works. And all of a sudden, we were sitting there at $50,000 a recorder. The model said we needed to get down to 10,000. We said, well, if we build over 1,000 of these things, it will be. And Blockbuster looked at that investment for those 1,000 units and said, we think DVD's too close. And the decision was made to can it. So all of a sudden, you know, almost overnight, we thought we were in a business, and we weren't. We were actually moving to San Diego from Panama City to do that. One of the times we almost moved to San Diego. Anyway, so you know, you lick your wounds, you look around and go, well, now what can we do with this domain expertise? So we looked around at other commercial opportunities, and what was happening? John Malone was all of a sudden having competition with DirecTV. John Malone owned TCI, the largest cable company at the time, back in the early 90s. And all of a sudden DirecTV came on the market, and you know, they were offering 100 channels, and he could only offer 30. And why could he only offer 30? Because they were all analog channels, and they were eating up all the bandwidth he had on his physical plant. And so we came back around, and I can't take credit for all this because SAIC kind of led the presentation on this, but it was basically that if you gave us one analog channel, we could give you back 12 digital channels. And all of a sudden he said, well, wait a minute, okay, so if I go into a market and I give you 10 analog channels, I still get my 20 analog channels to support my legacy boxes, my analog boxes, but I can take those 10 and turn it into 120? Yes, do it, okay? So all of a sudden SAIC started gearing up for this in about the 95, 96 time frame. And here we were coming out of this experience with being the experts in MPEG compression, basically how you do video compression. You know, we had a lot of investors in that venture because of the parallel processing that had to be done to basically do this conversion. So all of a sudden we had domain expertise, but there was a value for this digital cable opportunity. Well, little old Panama City SAIC came in, and within 6 weeks, we were the program. I became program manager. We basically had the program lead. We set up the first system acceptance test lab for digital cable out here on Tyndall Parkway. Okay, and we ended up launching digital cable not only in the United States but around the world, in Europe, Mexico, and South Korea is another story. We may or may not get to that. But all of a sudden, that was the business we were in. Now, that went on for a pretty good bit. We had the digital cable going on. We actually spun off of SAIC in '97 and formed our own company, DVA Group. That happened when SAIC basically concluded the first launch in Hartford in the fall of '97, and we immediately said, thank you, that's good enough. You know, the rates were a little premium at the time. And so on the way out the door, I got a tap on the shoulder and said, hey, could you maybe negotiate a transition from SAIC and have a little core Tiger team basically continue on? And so one of the toughest negotiations of my life was basically with the president and CEO, Bob Beister, Dr. Beister of SAIC, saying that this is what we'd like to do. We're going to keep SAIC on as a subcontractor, but you know, they want to transition. You've effectively lost the contract. You know, do I have your blessing? And all over the consternation of a lot of other people on the board, that was allowed. And so we made the transition, DVA was formed, and we became basically the lead for TCI, which was soon bought by AT&T. And we then diversified over into basically delivering content to hotels. Maybe you might not realize, but in those days, the way the hotels updated was they actually sent hard drives around, unencrypted hard drives. And so as a result, folks like Lucasfilms would not give their content to the hotels. You couldn't watch Star Wars in your hotel because they didn't want the risk of these hard drives unencrypted going around. So all of a sudden, the hotels and that had come to us and said, you work on this. So we worked about 3 years and basically had to take the system engineering and the encryption scheme to the 7 major movie studios and get their sign off and approval in order to deliver via satellite. And so we began delivering via satellite to the hotels. And that business went on pretty well. Problem was, guess what? Things change. And all of a sudden, TCI got bought by Comcast. Well, Comcast had a different philosophy on system acceptance test. They said, we got 10 million testers out there. Actually, it was probably up to about 40 million at that point for Comcast. Why do we need you to test? They'll let us know if it's not working. And sure enough, they decided that, they'd do a change and they'd just release it, and, if it didn't work, they'd find out about it pretty much. One of the instances that happened associated with, I think it was a Stanley Cup. And it was in the middle of one of the playoff games, and all of a sudden the system, basically one of the bugs showed up, and boom, it went down. And there was set-top boxes thrown through the business offices the next day. And so, you don't want to mess with people's cable TV. But anytime, really.
Yeah.
But one of the accomplishments, and I'm not sure when it got broken, but we set a record for the first time to do a million mobile device upgrade. As we hit, and that was probably in the 98 time frame where we had deployed enough and we needed to do a major change, and it wasn't cost effective to bring the set-top box back to the depot. We needed to push it out over the air, and it's one of those, and so we did it probably I'm sure it was probably like on a Saturday night at midnight, and so everybody is up. We had people on the phone from all the regions around the United States that were doing this. As we pushed this thing out, we'd obviously practice rollback, but boom, you push it out, and then you start getting the status reports in. And you think, watching the poll results Tuesday night was exciting. I tell you, hearing those different markets, major markets, respond that they were upgrading without issue was a very exciting night. But as I said, that market, when Comcast took it over, we kind of saw the handwriting on the wall. Just briefly on South Korea, we did switch domains and go international. Launched some in Europe, launched some in Mexico, went over to South Korea. Just very quickly, South Korea is different. They had basically 3 consortiums that were racing to basically launch digital TV. KPMG was heading up one of them. They were not doing too well. We got asked to replace them. We did. They had a projection to launch in 18 months, as did the other 2 consortiums. Given our experience, we basically were ready to do friendlies in less than 6 months. Well, again, being pretty naive about the whole international thing, we thought this was the best thing to do, right? We shaved a year off of the time to market. This solution's going to come in, which was a Motorola General Instrument solution, was going to dominate South Korea. Man, we're feeling good. We got the set-top boxes out there. The 100 friendlies started reporting in. Everything was baseline. We basically reported milestone met. Boom. The next day, the Ministry of Information sent out a notice to us and all our affiliates, anybody that was looking to use the solution, and said, your operating license will be revoked and your facilities will be padlocked if you don't cease and desist using this technology, period. And we're going, what the hell? Well, sure enough, you can imagine who might be behind that. Samsung, LG, had the other two consortiums. And all of a sudden, they were seeing something that happened very similar to cell phones. Basically, when Qualcomm came in with CDMA, they took over the Korean market, and they lost a lot of dominance there. And they said, this is not going to be another cell phone scenario. We're just going to stop it. Gave no reason. Obviously, Motorola and others took them to court. The State Department got involved, and to no avail. Luckily, we were burning probably at $400,000, $500,000 a month on this project, and I had a smart old sage business partner that said, before we go into a international domain like this, we're going to put $1 million in escrow account. So if anything happens here, all we have to do is show our valid receipts and invoices and go do that. And sure enough, you might imagine what happened to that consortium overnight. It basically collapsed within hours almost. Nobody could be reached. However, our $850,000 invoices were covered because we had that money in escrow. So a lot of lessons learned there, and some of them can be harder than others. Find somebody that has some domain expertise before you switch domains. 9/11 happened, and we were, again, what business are we in now, right? And this happened all about the same time, within probably weeks of each other. I think the South Korea deal collapsed in like July or August, and here 9/11 hit in September. We had about 65 people at the time, and like everybody, it struck us really hard. Everybody was distracted. I said, okay, let's do this. We're going to divide the company into 3 teams. Each team is going to have, to the end of the week, to do white papers on solutions that could help us prevent this from happening again. Whether it was onboard instrumentation, whether it's background checks, whether it's security, whether it's on-the-ground analytics, and basically at the end of the week, we had 3 white papers. Well, as fate often steps in, my old boss, who I kept a good relationship with from SAIC, gave me a call Saturday and said, hey, would you guys like to get back into national defense? And I said, yeah. I mean, I think, timing's right. We know it looks like we need some help. Looks like there's going to be some emphasis there. We'd like to chip in. He says, great, I'd like to introduce you to someone. And I said, well, let me do this. I've got these white papers. Let me forward them to you and see what you think about them. And so he looked at them and he called me back. He says, you mind if I share them? And I said, no, there's no intellectual property here. It was just, an exercise to basically allow people to, feel a little bit empowered that we're going to do something about this. He says, well, I'm going to pass them on to Dan Clusie. Well, Dan Clusie was the chairman of Iridium Satellite. In fact, Dan Clusie organized the LLC that bought Iridium out of bankruptcy in 2000, Iridium being the biggest bankruptcy before Enron, but it was several billions of dollars. And Dan Clusie negotiated him, and I think he had about 12 partners in the LLC, for like $30 million to buy the constellation of Iridium. And if you're not familiar with Iridium, that's made up of like 66 orbiting satellites in polar orbits that constantly cover the whole surface of the Earth. It's the only constellation that does that. And he got that for $30 million and a $30 million a year contract to continue to support the DoD, who was the biggest user at the time. But they were obviously underutilized and needed things to do with it. And so he said, if you guys got ideas on how you can use the Iridium constellation to solve this, bring it on. So on Monday, basically went to Annapolis, met him in his home, and by the end of the day, we, DVA, were the system integrator for Iridium for National Defense, and we began working on a project. Turned out, I learned very quickly that there was 3 generals that had been given autonomous shoot-down authority of commercial aircraft in the CONUS, or actually in any of our territories. One of those generals was out at Tyndall Air Force Base, one was in Cheyenne Mountain, and one was Alaskan Air Command. And you might imagine their apprehension that they were going to possibly be called to shoot down something as big as a 747 and take the lives of all those people in order to save collateral damage associated with another building or nuclear plant or whatever. And they wanted information. So we, again, switching domains, taking kind of the pieces we knew associated with global communications, data processing, put together a system whereby the Sky Marshals could have on their tungsten Ws with a Wi-Fi sled and battery pack associated with it, communicate with each other, communicate with the cockpit, and then versus the server on board, communicate directly with the interceptors that were out on the wing, or to any one of these generals that might be wanting more information. That Sky Marshal could directly communicate, here's what's going on board the airplane. Because what they wanted to know was, who was flying the darn thing? You know, if it was a good guy, he's going to crash it in the field in Pennsylvania. If it's a bad guy, he's going to try to crash it into the Pentagon. And so we need to know who's in charge. So that was the first step. Second was, we had this information on board that we're bringing off Iridium, we're bringing off through ground cellular. Then how about situational awareness about aircraft movements? You know, because rookies don't fly the same way as pros. And so we basically had a simulation where the general sitting in Cheyenne Mountain or 1st Air Force could have a visualization of what the pilot was looking at out the screen. And so he could see if it was doing this kind of thing. He would see it was doing this thing. As soon as a target or an opportunity of a glide point came, the general would see it at the same time the pilot would, and he could help make his decision. So we moved forward with that, got funding, $100 million funding to put the first prototypes on United Aircraft. We sold our home in Palo Alto on December 11, 2003, and we're getting ready to move to Tyson's Corner. On January 13th, I got a phone call from then Secretary Richard's office, who just became the new Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. And it was to inform me that the $100 million had been moved. It was now going to basically hire more people to reduce the lines at at the airports. And we had 30 days to shut down, and that was it. I'm going, darn, now what? So, another opportunity to pivot. And so, again, we looked at what technologies we had. Department of Homeland Security had just started this thing called Operation Safe Commerce. They wanted to go ahead and start tracking cargo containers. There was a real risk that we would put weapons of mass destruction, somebody would put a weapon of mass destruction in a cargo container, and all of a sudden, there'd be a problem. Lynn.
I want to back up to Iridium first.
Yeah.
Before you go to my file. Iridium was one hell of a deal, though, really, when it was built, wasn't it?
It still is. No, it still is.
It was, I don't know exactly how.
Their pivot business model, where they missed the business model, was they underestimated how quickly cell towers could be rolled out. Okay? Cell towers became commoditized. Where a cell tower was several $1 million, it came down to a few $100,000. And all of a sudden the rollout around the world of cell towers went like this. Their business model went like that. Okay? And today, that's still it. We don't, we on our devices, we have Iridium, we have cellular, we have wireless. Okay? We use least cost routing. Iridium is used less and less. Although sometimes where we need to use it, since we use GSM cellular, places like South Korea, some parts of Japan, some parts of South America that use CDMA, even parts of the United States that don't have GSM, we got to rely on Iridium. So Iridium is a gap fill now, but they went public and they got money. They're putting up a new constellation. They've got a space for a 450-pound payload that basically is going to be the next generation air traffic control system. So now you're not going to have to use radars to track aircraft. You're going to have spacecraft tracking aircraft, and it's going to be a whole different ballgame. So Iridium is coming around, but how many times have they pivoted?
Well, I mean, the thing about it is that the Department of Defense was really the money for Iridium. I mean, the Department of Defense used Iridium satellites for a lot of stuff.
They still do. The prices come down, so it's used for more. Okay.
I understood it originally. It was like $6 a minute.
Well, but now what it's used for is not voice that much, right? It's data. It's M to M. It's machine to machine. They came in, and part of it we forced this. The first device we delivered to Homeland Security to track containers in 2004. The only Iridium modem they had was the size literally of a brick. It was a cast aluminum housing. It was that big and $850, okay, and 8 batteries, okay. We pushed them for a couple of years to say we need something smaller. You have this mode cost short burst data where we send a couple hundred bytes. That's all we need. Give us a modem that's just that. We actually went back to Dan Calusi's home, had dinner with him at his home, and made the proposition that we would build it or they would build it, and they ended up building it. They got the air interface from Motorola, and they did. And so now we have a nice smaller modem. Thing sells for more like $50, okay? You basically send a message for about less than 10 cents. And so all of a sudden there's a value proposition there, and Iridium works for a lot of things where you don't have wireless or you don't have cellular.
Okay, so now a guy can be sitting in a box somewhere, Tyndall Air Force Base or someplace, controlling a drone over Afghanistan, okay? What system are they using to do that quickly? Is that another system?
It is, yeah. And there's lots of satellite systems, and that's a military system, and it's a high bandwidth. When you get into communications, and that's a whole nother topic I don't want to dive into, but it's all about bandwidth, it's all about coverage, it's all about reliability and redundancy, and whether it's one way or two way. So there's lots of attributes associated with global satellite communication, okay? So, but Iridium, it has its niche for things. Inmarsat has its niche for things, and Galaxy 7 for DirecTV. There's different niches for different satellites.
Well, this ability to control a drone, sitting at a desk somewhere and controlling it in Afghanistan. I mean, this thing must really, really be fast.
Well, again, it is all about bandwidth, but I'll tell you, okay, one of the things we did, okay, is we started doing container tracking is we got the contract to track all the food into Iraq. We tracked it from Kuwait, from Turkey, from Saudi Arabia, from Jordan, and 3,000 Mercedes trucks delivering to 200 kitchens, and we were responsible that it got there safe and sound, right? And so all of a sudden, we would remotely, or the customer remotely, okay, could adjust those devices. Okay, number one, and we did it with sending two variables, because we had 2,000 geozones on the device that basically linked together and could form a corridor for a nice tight highway where the attribute was, if you stop in this corridor, send the cavalry. If you get more than an eighth of a mile off this corridor, send the cavalry. Or if you pass from here to here, give this guy a phone call, etc. All these automated functions that were stored on the device, okay? Sending basically two variables. One, what was the supply chain, i.e. what point was your origin, what point was your destination. The device would all of a sudden configure all those geozones together. The second is, what am I carrying? And why do you need to know that? Because all the sensors on the device would change to calibrate to sensor thresholds. Am I carrying ice cream or am I carrying lettuce here? What's my threshold relative to temperature? Am I carrying and on the dry goods? Am I carrying sensitive electronics that have a G threshold of this? Or am I carrying bags of cereal that have a threshold of this? And so you could basically set all your sensitive thresholds from a profile and your destination, origin, and your route through that. And so very cost effectively, remotely from anywhere on Earth to any other place on Earth, you can do that. And so that's what we do today. That kind of spun into different things. I want to get through this so we can get into some other question and dialogue, but basically we pivoted again into, okay, we're now the experts and know how to track, and that we've resisted going commodity, although we're making some lower cost units now. It's just a different market, right? Commodity versus high end, it's a different market, so we resist that. But we did say, boy, it sure would be nice if there was a different wireless technology that we could use, and particularly what's called sense and respond logistics, a wireless technology that Bluetooth doesn't work at, that Zigbee doesn't work at, that Wi-Fi doesn't work at, that can basically track hundreds of thousands of things at a time that are mobile and moving around, so you can keep track of what's going on. Not only where they are, but what state are they in? Have they been dropped? Are they damaged? They've been vandalized? So they had a breach? What's going on? And so over the last 10 years, we in conjunction with the DoD in a partnership, about a 50-50. At one point, we were spending more on the DoD. Now, since Cubic didn't spend too much, and I haven't been spending that much since I took it back over, the DoD probably has spent slightly more, but it's on the order of $35 million. We developed a protocol. And now I'm in a position of, okay, do we pivot again? Which business am I in? Are we in global tracking business, or are we in the wireless protocol business? And we're struggling with that because we're kind of in both. And what's happening is one is bootstrapping the other, right? Okay, our established legacy global tracking stuff has a revenue stream that we put into basically finishing up the MIST products, and that's basically where you find us today. And on a daily basis, I pivot about, are we going to sell through VARs? Are we going to license? The current model is we really don't want to dominate any vertical space with this. We want to go to find best of breed in a particular channel and upgrade their service. Maybe they're trying to make Zigbee or Bluetooth work where it really doesn't fit, to change them over to this. So that's our current model. So in a nutshell, I've taken you through almost 40 years there of pivoting, and I can tell you, through that, starting in '83, I still have some of the same partners and the same people we work with that are like-minded and have similar domain expertise. So it has been, from my standpoint, very successful in that we've been able to maintain those relationships, really never compromised on either the quality or the way we do business, and always looked more strategically in the long term. So some guiding principles as you start to look at your pivoting alternatives. Oh, and I guess that is the, yeah. So one of the things we are looking at, I'll just highlight real quick, is we are looking at where to go with first adopters. Obviously, the DoD is a partner, so we're doing first adopter things. They're tracking water and fuel and mobile bridges and ammunition and different things that the MIST is uniquely qualified for. But we're also doing domestic and commercial and rail. We have done validation testing on a dedicated 110-car train out in Pueblo that's going very well. And we just got the opportunity to start working on a humanitarian project, basically what we call MISBIT, but basically an alert bracelet for refugee women that are 1 in 6 are violated in the refugee camps, and basically by tapping within less than a minute she can alert security as to where she is and that she's in trouble. And so we get alert, and we basically moving forward with some prototypes on that. And that would be very, very exciting and very rewarding if that happened to be our kind of our launch that got us over the cliff, was going humanitarian and helping in what's otherwise a very dismal situation. So, yes?
I know that there has been a whole lot of information as it relates to Panama City advancing, and Eastern has this huge contract that they just got. Jellyfish is doing the new jobs with advanced money tied to it. I'm not sure that people understand the technology that you have has also recently made local advancements. Haven't you recently signed some pretty nice contracts as it relates to companies?
We have, and I did share some of that. Since we're videotaping, I can't share all of that news. But 3 of them are in the aerospace industry, so it kind of taps into the strategy of bringing aerospace, the fact that we can tout ourselves as a world-class supply chain management service for the airline industry, airline manufacturers. I think kind of helps add to the critical mass. And so we have shared that information and look forward to contributing with that strategy.
And if you were to give one single piece of advice as it relates to pivoting to startups or entrepreneurs or businesses in general, what would you pull from all the things? You've experienced such an array of different things going through pivoting, some from necessity, some from, most often from necessity, but I'm sure there's been those times when you were just doing improvements, but.
Don't do it unless you have to. It's kind of like moving houses. Don't move houses unless you have to. It takes a lot of energy. And there's a lot of risk. I mean, think about when you just move houses, you got new neighbors and you got new, traffic patterns getting to work. You got lots of risk. I mean, you pivot and all of a sudden you're in a different space, and so be ready for that because it's going to take a lot of energy, a lot more than it would just be staying the course and make it work. So if there's a way to make your current business plan work, try that first. If it, just out of ideas, not hope, or the opportunity is just so golden you want to grab that brass ring, then fine, but be prepared and prepare your team. And that's I wanted to kind of get to that because how should you pivot? It's really important that you don't do this in a vacuum and say, come in tomorrow and say, guess what? We're going global with our service. And you see everybody, deer in the headlight, we're doing what? We can hardly handle, our local customers and, you're going to put this service over in Russia? What do you mean? What are you doing? And so, you've got to share it and talk about it because it's going to affect everybody. And so share it with your partners and all your stakeholders. Could affect, your current customers as well. And then ensure now that you have the correct makeup of the team, because guess what? Some of the team might not fit anymore, okay? And you need to deal with that. And boy, of all the things I don't like dealing with, HR is at the top. And, because the happy team is a productive team, and you don't know, it's kind of like pickup sticks. You might think that stick wasn't attached, and all of a sudden you pull it out and you start seeing everything fall apart because there was coupling there that you just weren't aware about. So think about it before you let go somebody. Think about it before you add somebody, all right? But look at your team resource mix. And then finally, the resources and expenditure. Your cash flow is going to change, and which is, again, of all the things I look at in business analysis, cash flow is like the top 5. I mean, you got to have the cash flow. Otherwise, you can be distracted in so many ways, either running from or trying to satisfy those people you owe money or trying to convince people you're good for it. It just doesn't work. So make sure you model your cash flow and understand that. And I think this is the last slide. So while it can be daunting, companies can navigate it successfully, and many do. Happens every day. I'd like to say I'm an example of it, but I'd say the vote's still out. For the business that are sustainable and whose metrics don't support the current vision, pivoting direction can be a great way to get back on track and sustaining growth. It can pull your fat out of the fire. It can basically make you a big fish in in a small pond or a big fish in a big pond, depending on the choices you make. So don't shy away from it, but go into it with your eyes open and go into it as a team. And that's it.
Thank you so much. I'm sure, Randy, you have a question?
Sure.
Okay, go for it.
First one, Ed Barreto flew one unmanned system using the Iridium system of signal all the way across the Atlantic. There was a 30-minute delay in between the reaction of the system, if there was something going wrong, to the control station to be able to see what the problem was. So if it was going down, you have 30 minutes to know that it was going down, and then 30 minutes again for it to get a new command.
And there's other things going on there besides Iridium communication, because we've had to maintain, and we have to validate this occasionally, but we have to maintain a 2-minute response time from any 2 points on Earth. That if there is an incident with a DoD piece of equipment or cargo that happens, then somebody anywhere that needs to know about it. And so you have the delay of the device recognizing an incident, the device dialing up and sending Iridium, the Iridium transmission to the server, the authentication, decryption, processing, the database, then you reconfigure, you send it out then to that person via text or email, so you have delays possibly in that. And all that has to take less than 2 minutes. And that happens. That's kind of worst case, actually. So Iridium is great, but guess what? You got to be outdoors. I mean, one of the things, I will disclose, is we track Pratt & Whitney jet engines. We've been doing Pratt & Whitney's jet engines for a decade now. And they store a lot of them indoors, obviously. And so Iridium doesn't work too well. And so that's why you have to have the GSM, and GSM towers, sometimes they work and sometimes they don't, as you know. You go to all of a sudden you get off the airplane, you go in and you turn your phone on. How long does it take to register sometimes? Okay, we got to account for that delay, right? That all of a sudden we popped up out of a ship on the other side of the world, and all of a sudden we got this data we need to give to somebody, but we got to register first. We got to get on communications. So there are some delays even with cellular. Iridium, the nice thing is you pop up, you're on the network regardless where you are, unless you're in North Korea or someplace like that. Lynn.
One of the more interesting part of your story that you told from another time I was listening to this was when you were tracking the containers going into Afghanistan. You had a system where you could track virtually everything, as you were saying. And there is no tracking system coming into the United States with our ports out on containers. I mean, there's sort of a mishmash of some sort of stuff out there. It's just amazing to me that the technology exists, that you can track containers all over the world, but nobody does it.
Value proposition. Value proposition. So the DHS spent, I don't know, on Operation Safe Commerce Phase 2, Operation Safe Commerce Phase 3, and subsequent, I've tracked a couple $100 million, okay? 2 years ago, they abandoned trying to force a standard, and what they have now is devices that go through Sandia National Lab for certification. We were actually the first ones to get certified for that back in like 2006, and we've been certified since. So that's the approach they took. So if you want security, it's available, and there's somebody there that's done the consumer electronics version of certification for it. The only requirement right now for containers is a tempered steel bolt that goes on the locking latch on the container and has a number. Unfortunately, you can buy those, you can counterfeit them, and so it has turned out to be not a very useful, but that was their response, and that's what we have right now. Now, some of our customers are, again, I do this through a value-added reseller, but they're the largest chemical companies in the world, okay, that track hazardous material. The largest manufacturers of foods, okay, because they want to know quality of service, particularly on temperature and humidity. And so at a particular domain level, there are, high definition TVs and electronics. So we track a lot of iPods and, a lot of Apple equipment, those kind of things that are easy to steal and easy to, sell. So a lot of it depends on the risk profile of the product, not necessarily the risk profile of where it came from and what's the probability. Now, I can tell you, being somewhat close to it, that they do a lot of analysis on every container that comes in. Where was its origin? Who was, loading it? There's things called CT-PAT, which basically you can certify the origin, okay, which prevents you from having to go through a secondary inspection. We inspect a lot of containers. So I want to give credit to DHS doing what they can, but quite frankly, the market pushed back and said, no, I understand it's less than $100 a load to have all this sophisticated tracking, but I can't afford it. I'm in a competitive market here moving these what do they call it, plastic dog ship from China, and it just doesn't justify putting a tracking device on there. So, a little off topic, but
That's okay. Anybody else got a question? I would like to thank you so very much
Sure.
for coming. We appreciate it. It's always way interesting information, and I'm sure every time you kind of got followers so that when you talk, they'll be here again next time to hear the stories, because you do have some good stories.
well, hopefully it's not changing that much, but there will hopefully be a new chapter. But thanks for the opportunity, Pamela.
Thank you.
All right.
Appreciate it.
Yep.